Hi, I'm vegan, and I have experience living and working in Cambodia, Laos, Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland China, Thailand, and a few other places. I get questions from time to time from other vegetarians and vegans asking what it's like to live in that part of the world. Some of them are asking because they're interested in what is it like to be vegan in a third world tropical context. Some of them are asking more in terms of the cultural differences between countries. Maybe they're interested in the Buddhist angle. And some are asking because they're interested in terms of the infamous brutality of a lot of these cultures in terms of how they treat animals. I guess that's maybe an impression that's largely based on images that appear on television and the internet from the fur industry in China, or the fact that in Southeast Asia people eat dogs in addition to pigs and pythons and everything else. So I'm going to try to make a quick video that gives one answer for what's obviously a pretty diverse part of the world's map. I really try not to say anything that other people have already said on the internet because I don't see the point of it. For me personally, honestly, the single biggest difference between being in a decadent Western society and being out in Southeast Asia was the presence of parasites, parasitic infections, bacterial infections, and so on being carried in meat. Arguments about food safety seem very abstract when you're in a Western country where maybe you're only pointing to some vague statistics about the number of sick days per year that meat eaters take versus vegetarians or vegans. When you're living in a context where people really get hospitalized with sort of terrifying bacteria and parasites and what have you, many of which, stick around with you for life or have very long-term implications, you ask yourself, how can people knowingly subject themselves to this, and for no reward? They don't get anything out of it, but they can, and the people around you will answer that question for you. They'll always be forthcoming with what their rationale is for why they disregard the harm they're doing to their own health and the harm they're doing to the animals and to the environment around them. So if you're a vegan for ethical and ecological reasons, you'll suddenly find yourself in Southeast Asia pleading with people who are your coworkers or your friends or what have you. You'll find yourself trying to reason with people in a completely amoral way to get them to stop eating meat. The ugliness and brutality of the meatpacking industry and the filth of what it is to have a diet that's based on eating rotting corpses, that's fundamentally the same all over the world. But it's true that in a tropical third world context, it's harder for people to kid themselves about it. You don't have the veneer of, plastic and styrofoam. And most of the time you don't have, you just don't have walls built up that'll block your view from seeing what you're really eating, where it comes from, and how it died. I guess that brings me to point two. I personally, when I was living and working in Southeast Asia, I've seen all kinds of animals slaughtered in front of my eyes. Not just pigs and cows, but wild animals, endangered animals. In the middle of a biological conservation area, I saw them killing pangolin to feed to tourists. When you're in a part of the world that has no electricity or very little access to electricity, then one of the reasons why people are so cruel to animals is that they tend to try to keep them alive right up until the time when they're going to be eaten. So, you'll see wild animals being kind of bound and gagged and dragged along in terrible conditions so that they're finally killed as close to the customer or as close to the plate as possible. In general, if you really see exposés of how, for example, the fur industry works in Russia or Sweden, it is every bit as brutal as it is in China or Southeast Asia. I think that Western countries simply have a much greater ability to shield themselves from public view. and again to package these things as products in a way that looks antiseptic, and that the package doesn't in any way resemble the process that produced it. Living in that context, you also become familiar with how powerful the human imagination is in deceiving itself. People who do not want to see what's right in front of their eyes, they won't see it. And the same way that people can convince themselves that eating this stuff is good for their health when it isn't. I mean, I guess point 3 on my list here, if I'm counting, would be that the ecological impacts are also very visible. If you have your eyes open, you're willing to see it. I remember living and working in a small village where there was one river, one small trickle of a river, where everybody washed their clothes, and where the children went to play, and where sometimes people went to bathe. And that same river, it had become overrun with cows. Cattle were provided by European charities as ways of trying to alleviate poverty. In my biased opinion, it only makes the poverty worse. And one of the ways it makes it worse is that those cows are then crowding around that river. They're pooing into that river. They defecate. I mean, we use this word in English, runoff. Runoff. Runoff means sewage without a sewer. And that's exactly what happens. Everything that comes out of the cow, including when they slaughter the cows, and then you have, of course, the blood and guts and what have you, pouring into that same small river. So, the scarcity of those resources and the ecological impacts and the human impacts, it's very real. Some of it is hard to measure. Some of it's easy to measure. But boy, if you've got your eyes open, you're willing to see it, it's right there for you to see. So I guess the fourth and final point on my informal list here, to keep things very brief, will be people who ask about the cultural angle. All of the countries I've mentioned, they are third world tropical countries, but they're also countries that have Buddhist heritage. So it's very different to be vegetarian in Cambodia than it would be to be vegetarian in Indonesia. Indonesia is a majority Muslim country. It also has a Buddhist history, but its Buddhist history was largely exterminated. So very different from being vegetarian in Catholic countries of South America or what have you. I think some tourists show up expecting these Buddhist cultures to be a vegan paradise. If you look at the statistics, and there are real statistics, the hard statistics for how many tons of cattle get slaughtered every year, how many tons of pork produced, and so on. If you're willing to look at those statistics, you will see that there is very little reality behind that hype. On the one hand, a country like Taiwan has a very vocal, organized vegan minority. On the other hand, they have a voracious meat-eating majority. And the amount of meat that gets imported and locally produced and consumed has only increased and increased. Same is true, I mean, for all the other Buddhist countries. In terms of your daily life and dealing with the culture, that echo of Buddhism, I would say, mostly has the potential to increase conflict. When you're in a country that has no connection to vegetarianism or veganism in its history, if they just regard this as a foreign idea or a new idea, then you don't have the same tension, the same potential for conflict that comes out of the contrast between Buddhism's historical ideals and the rather depressing reality of what the modern culture is like. You'll often enough be talking to people, many times I heard, oh yeah, I had a grandfather who was vegetarian. He was much more Buddhist than I was. Oh yeah, my grandmother. More often what you'll encounter are people who have a vague cultural awareness that vegetarianism and nonviolence were ideals that Buddhism was supposed to aspire to. In the same way, of course, Buddhist cultures in historical reality all had slavery, all had torture. So the meaning of nonviolence in these contexts is worth thinking about carefully. Many foreigners see as a conflict-avoiding side of East Asian culture really ends up escalating conflict, because many of the people in the service industry will feel that they can lie to you in the same way that in Western culture a parent might lie to a child, saying anything that's necessary just to get you to sit down, just to get you to stay in your seat, just to get you to get on the train, whether or not it's the right train, just to, go through the motions of serving the meal, getting you in and out of the store, whatever the case might be. And that's really a different attitude from trying to rip you off. It's a different attitude from lying to you in a malicious sense. But I mean, you'll get to encounter again and again the sense of real surprise that it's a problem when the waiter brings you something that they promised you would be vegetarian and that actually has pieces of meat in it. Living in this kind of context, you do have to ask yourself what attitude you're going to take. How are you going to respond when someone you care about is hospitalized because they're eating meat? What kind of attitude are you going to take when, for the 10th time, the waiter brings you something that's not really vegetarian? I remember I worked in one village where every day just one wooden cart would show up at the morning market with one slaughtered pig. You'd see the animals being killed, but you'd also just see the filth of a bloody corpse covered with flies that comes bouncing down the road in a wooden cart, getting some dirt and dust on it, getting rained on if it was raining, and so on. And the most lurid spectacle of all is not the killing of the pig, and it's not the corpse in the cart. The most terrible thing to behold are the excuses the people are making themselves. We like to say in English that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We don't say as often that ugliness is in the eye of the beholder also. Human beings have a tremendous capacity to not see what's right in front of their faces when it suits their purpose. They have the capacity to ignore diseases even when it's really harming people around them, even when it's really resulting in deaths, people that they know. And, they have that capacity to ignore the suffering of animals literally in their own backyard. That human capacity for self-deception is really the most brutalizing spectacle of all.